All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the fourth and final week of the Midwest Culturally Inclusive Conference. This is our first session of this week. We have a couple more, and then we are ending with our keynote in person on Thursday evening, so I hope you all can make it. Today's session is entitled The Impact of Laura Jane Grace from Scared Queer Kid to LGBTQ plus Activism. We do have some community standards during the Midwest Culturally Inclusive Conference. I'm going to verbalize a few here and also explain a little bit about the Zoom webinar format. So please obtain consent before taking any photos, screenshots, or copying text, or generally sharing content that is not your own. Your microphone and camera are off for all of our participants. This is a Zoom webinar format, and so how this works is that it focuses on the hosts or presenters, and they're able to have their camera on and interact and engage kind of as normal. But for you participants, you still have access to the chat, and there's also a Q&A section. So we do encourage you to kind of dialogue and interact in that way. But this really gives the main focus and attention on our presenter, Elliot, here today. So he has a lot of content to share with us, but there will be times if you want to ask questions throughout or possibly at the end. Please use the Zoom chat and message us. I know that it can feel confusing or like maybe something's broken or off. So please feel free to interact with us and we'll try to help problem solve anything. We utilize live closed captioning during all of our sessions during the Midwest Culturally Inclusive Conference. The live closed captioning is turned on now. So if you look on your Zoom taskbar and see the CC button, it's also possibly located under the More button and click View Live Transcript. You should be able to see the live transcript going. Again, please utilize the Zoom chat if you're having any difficulties with this. The QR code on your screen directly links to our Campus Climate YouTube page, where we are housing all of the recordings, all of the sessions that are being recorded during the Midwest Culturally Inclusive Conference. These are also posted in Whova. However, they will live on our Campus Climate YouTube page indefinitely. We are recording sessions to make them as accessible as possible for those who cannot attend live. And so you can rewatch any sessions at any point if you'd like to. As I said before, if you have questions throughout this session, please utilize the Zoom chat. You can message us either publicly or privately. There's a list of folks who are here today to help you out. We are also monitoring our Campus Climate email address during this session and throughout all of the sessions through the remainder of the month as well. And finally, I would like to introduce the session for today, entitled The Impact of Laura Jane Grace from Scared Queer Kid to LGBTQ plus Activism. This is being presented to us today by Elliott Parsons. Come hear Elliott's tale of coming out at a rural university in the middle of Missouri. We will talk about the impact punk rock had on his transition, mental health, and activism. We will conclude this presentation by talking about things he has learned through transition and becoming an activist. I will now turn things over to Elliott Parsons.
There we go. Yay! I hope everyone's well. Let me do the share screen. All panelists who can share. Oh, that's an immense. Okay. Technology confuses me. There we go. I think it's. I always forget which F button do you like do full screen. I always forget. I'll just go here. Slideshow. There we go. All right. So thank you for introducing me, Emily. As she said, the title of this presentation is The Impact of Laura Jane Grace from Scared Queer Kid to LGBTQ activism. My name is Elliott Parsons. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am the coordinator of the Doyle Center for Gender Sexuality at UW-Platteville. I'm going to move you all to the bottom. There we go. So just a few disclosures before we begin. It is a traumatic coming out tale. Sexual and relationship violence, it'll be discussed. It won't be, we won't dive deep into it, to be honest with you, but it will be discussed. A very tiny, not like insignificant, but very small mention of child abuse will also be mentioned throughout the presentation as well, as with bullying. And I'll be honest, I do curse a little bit. So I'll just give you content warning up front there. And there's always a possibility of other triggers that I have missed. So I also would like to say that if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And I've also instructed Kate and Emily to feel free to interrupt me at any time they like to for any questions that you have. So, all right. So just a little bit of where we're heading. We're gonna spend a little bit of time on some terms and people. Then we'll go directly into stories, lessons learned, action steps, and next steps. And then we'll have a Q&A afterwards as well. So many of you, I would imagine, don't know who Laura Jane Grace is. Like, who the hell is this person, right? The best way, she is I would call her more pop punk music artist in the punk scene, who I discovered probably actually right before she came out. Like the album before her coming out album came out, and I thought, oh, this is cool. And then I remember reading through YouTube comments of day of all places and saying, well, this person, the people kept saying, well, she just came out as trans. Oh my gosh. And there were not great comments as well, obviously. And so I ran into a Rolling Stone article, and she had come out as trans. So essentially, she's a transgender punk rock artist that is highly regarded in the punk scene. Punk, this can mean different things to so many different people, just as any terms. For me, punk is not, I don't consider it just kind of the underground like some people consider it. I also include pop music in that too. I also would like to say I prefer the term like protest music in general, because I think that's more describes the type of music that I like, but punk, just that scene is what I identify it more as. So basically it's anything that encourages you just to be yourself and the ability to kind of just fight back against oppression. I also want to throw out there, I had a whole slide on this that I ended up deleting, that rock and roll in general was not created by European Americans, and it was very much has a lot of history with BIPOC folks as well. So, however, I was really influenced more just because of some of the BS media representation by some of the more European American artists that exist. So queer, it's just kind of an umbrella term. For me, what it means is I personally take the activist approach to the term queer. I also use it kind of as identity too. I kind of just say queer shorthand to identify myself often. And I also use queer, not everybody in the LGBTQ community agrees with this, as an umbrella term for all the LGBTQ identities. And again, if you have any questions about a term I use, feel free to ask. All right, so let's dive into story time. So I was a Kansas City, Missouri suburbs native, and I always like this, all suburbs are exactly the same, so just think of your traditional suburb. I personally don't like the suburbs for a variety of different reasons, but that would take an entire slideshow to get into why I don't like the suburbs. I have the traditional trans mass story that you hear in a lot of different ways. It's a trauma story. I think one problem with a lot of the narratives out there right now is that people just kind of expect trauma to happen, and they don't really want to encourage some of the more hey, here's my life actually wasn't this terrible and awful mess. I think that's something I would like to see more of. Unfortunately, that's not this presentation though. And again, it's the basic trans mass story. From day one, I never felt like the assigned gender that I was born with. I was always attracted to more masculine toys, clothing, and activities, and I should throw the word traditionally masculine. And as with a lot of these stories, my puberty was very, very traumatic. Now, there's always exceptions though, right? A lot of people, I think, still think that being trans means that you're automatically straight. I'm a very, very gay, not completely gay, very, very gay, trans masculine individual. survivor of significant relationship and sexual abuse. I have learning difficulties and mental health issues. And I think this is something that is very problematic in the narratives too, is that a lot of people are like, oh, transition, they solved all of my problems and like my life is great now. That's not necessarily true. Transition does not solve everybody's problems, and it does solve a significant problem in that, oh, I don't want to die anymore, for example, but there's still issues that can exist after transitions for a variety of different reasons. I'm a heavier person too. I feel like a lot of the narratives focus on what's traditionally seen as attractive, I guess is the word I'm looking for. And I think for me, punk is really kind of where I found my identity, courage, and just voice in general. So this is actually where I have notes. So just a quick childhood summation. The very first memory, we all kind of had that first memory of like, what's the first thing that I remember growing up, right? And for me, it was just running away from bullies and just general loneliness at a religious daycare. I was constantly told that I was gay and stupid time and again with if no actual adult intervention. And then if you ever brought it up, I was just often gaslighted and silenced when it was ever brought up. Special education and pre-college education, it was in some just a really crappy experience for me, if I'm being honest with you all. I was put into special ed in first grade with no explanation of what that actually meant. It may experience with boredom to watered down curriculum to more gaslighting, more bullying, and just generally just not being included in any decisions about like my education, and just often feeling like, oh, I have no future. I dated a 21-year-old when I was 15 going on 16. I don't think anyone realized he was 21 except for me. In retrospect, this is the definition of child abuse. The entire relationship probably would have been defined by abuse even outside of the age difference though. Aspects of like not knowing really anything about sex, hating every aspect of what was happening to my body, and just generally just hating myself led me to being with this person for 2 years actually, and not realizing it was abuse until after the fact. In all places, a psychology class in college when we were going over like relationships, and they handed me this list of like, hey, here's some signs that you might be in an abusive relationships, and you connect with every single thing on the list, and you're just like, well, shit. So essentially the combination of puberty, abuse, and mistreatment essentially just led to the chronic condition of just wanting to die all the time and just feeling like it was nothing but garbage. I will say though, the one protective factor that I had was that I had a family that generally was very supportive, which research has shown time and again that having a supportive family can be a huge buffer in preventing suicide. Another reality is that I was born in 1989. I don't consider myself to be old yet, but at that time there really was not all that much education about LGBTQ issues. Like even for the first couple of letters, like there really was not that much mention of like what any of that meant. And when it was shown in a very, very negative light. I would constantly like be told that, oh, you're obviously gay, and as if it was this terrible and awful thing. I think, but the ultimate buffer, I think, in my childhood was just kind of the introduction of punk rock and rock and roll in general. I think a kind of funny thing about this was that the first dive that I had into rock and roll technically was my dad, but I don't count that because you can't like the same thing as your parents, right? But I played softball. I was at a softball after party, and they were making fun of this band called CKY, and I'm just like, well, actually, I kind of really, really like this. I didn't say anything. But yeah, after that, I just dove into more and more and more bands, and just kind of seeing the expression and seeing the expression of emotions and be able to relate to a variety of different things in rock music in general, like was probably like a huge buffer. And just seeing that, it's okay to be yourself and it's okay to fight back when people are like being really shitty to you, that's okay. So enter college. Relationships didn't technically end right away when I was in college, but it basically did. The college plan was to go to community college, flunk out, and just kill myself. That was the general plan. I was very fearful, depressed, and anxious college students from the very beginning. However, I had some very great professors actually during this time. With the help of professors mostly, I flipped the I can't do college script very, very slowly. The pressing discomfort with myself, trauma, and general mental health stuff, and what I know now is dysphoria. It, however, just kept getting louder and louder and louder, and I didn't really know what any of it meant. Unfortunately, just as I was getting my feet wet in the whole, oh, I can do college thing, I entered yet another abusive relationship that would enter 1.5 years. It would push me to some very dark places, impacting my grade, and probably actually pushed my eventual transition back quite a bit. And it confirmed a lot that I really just didn't like myself whatsoever. At this time, however, like with punk music, specifically starting to dig more into kind of some feminist punk rock, it probably really kept me alive at this point. So technically, I came out as a lesbian pre-transfer, but to be honest with you, none of that really is significant enough to bring up on this particular presentation. I was part of the LGBTQ group at my community college, but I did help put on a drag show. Okay, maybe I don't give that enough credit, but I don't really consider that a big significant point in my life, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I did keep diving deeper and deeper into punk music. I did come out to my folks, which I had not done before after transitioning to a university and living on my own, which is a very common experience. And they were accepting, but in a way, it kind of made things worse. It was a feeling of both identifying with the queer community and not. I just kept wondering, like, there's something missing here, but I don't understand what is missing here. Laura Jane Grace publicly came out in the Rolling Stone in 2012. The article obviously was like problematic in so many different ways. I don't recommend going back and reading that article, if I'm being honest with y'all. But seeing kind of like someone prominent from the scene I loved so much, it was kind of a shook moment. At the same time, I met folks who identified what is now known as non-binary. This person identified at the time, I believe they just identified as queer at the time, if I remember correct. It's been a while, I'm sorry. And I met a trans woman who would become the closest thing to a friend that I ever had. And we still text every so often, which is kind of cool. And it kind of like really scared me. At this time, I also started privately, I didn't tell anyone, I started privately identifying as non-binary too. I didn't tell anybody. And honestly, like really scared me how much more comfortable this identification made me feel. Things still felt significantly off in ways that I can, again, identify as dysphoria now, but I don't know, I felt like I was onto something. Do remember that trans identities are only just now barely being recognized widely, even in the queer community in 2012. The mainstream representation usually is super negative and very problematic, let's be honest, and it involves trans women. having accessible language and positive representation to describe your experience is a privilege too often taken away from marginalized folks. Given this idea, the idea of actually coming out just seemed impossible for me. Part two, transfer. I don't really care to get into the reason why I transferred. But I ended up transferring again, this time to the rural university in what is known as Warrensburg, Missouri. This is a university that is an hour and 15 minutes probably from Kansas City. At this time, the dysphoria, fear, and loneliness, and just general hatred towards myself was killing me. Going to a rural university that's even more conservative than Platteville amplified these to the max. And so at this time, though, that I was really starting to go to concerts because I actually had access to a car, which previously I did not have access to. I went to my first Against Me show in Kansas City that Laura and Against Me went to since Laura had come out. And this was probably one of the most magical experiences that I can say I've ever did, because there was people around me who I could actually like relate to. And I didn't explicitly say anything to these folks, but they were saying things that I was just like, oh my gosh, it's totally me. Like, what's going on here? Something else that was really cool is that at this concert, the main act not only was able to start transitioning, but she was actually making it. And it actually, in a weird way, kind of revamped her career. The album is what I'm referring to when I say that. Like, she had kind of slowly started tapering off, but this album kind of made her skyrocket a little bit more than she had previously been at, and it was amazing. It kind of scared me too, again, the idea of coming out, like, what if this identifying more and more with something that that society really does not like, just is a scary experience. But at the same time, seeing punk shows over and over again, it just, this idea of like saying, well, F what society thinks, just be yourself, kept getting more and more ingrained in my head. Going back to the university after the show, it was a scary experience. I did come out to my former friend Megan as non-binary, and soon after, just the women, gender, and sexuality department. I was a psychology student, and I just took WGS classes, so it wasn't like that was the main focus when I was at the university. I went to more and more shows, and boy, just so many shows. Oh, I forgot that was a point on the PowerPoint. I don't even know how many Against Me / General or Jane Grey shows I've been to at this point. I always go alone and always get to meet some really cool people. There's just an instant shared interest and so many out trans people, which I do have mild anxiety issues. So like the idea that, oh wait, I have this topic that I can like instantly connect to someone. Let's just bring this up. You can talk for hours and hours about this one thing. It's really cool. It's also just a cool place to experiment because I'd likely never see these folks again. And the nature of the artist pretty much guarantees that folks are gonna be trans friendly. It's very cathartic is the word that I came up with when you go to a punk rock show. And it's also, this is a band that was small enough that you could just hang by the bus afterwards and meet the artist. This is the fanboy coming up to me. Don't judge me. Actually, feel free to judge me. I don't care. I often brag that Laura Jane Grace knows me by name at this point. And actually, I didn't put this in the slideshow or even my notes. She pretty much, like every significant big trans moments, I went to an Against Me show afterwards, and every single time, like she would congratulate me on every single milestone. And again, that's a fanboy moment, I know, but it was really cool. So, but nonetheless, by the time I finished my undergrad, I was extremely suicidal. I was becoming aware that I probably identified more as male and that I desperately needed to physically transition. I was biting my chest and even started packing some off and on by this point, and hated, well, that's really, I essentially just hated everything about myself and my body. I told Megan I was a man. She took it well. I actually probably wouldn't have still been here without Megan, to be honest with you. It was beyond helpful just to have that one person who knew. I stayed in Warrensburg for my grad program and got a job as a tutor manager. Some people ask me, why did you stay in Warrensburg? They have a really good program in higher ed administration. And I'm just like, I'm already here, so why not stay? I was a straight A student the entire time, but I also just wanted to die all the time. I also just couldn't connect with anyone in my cohort, which I don't know if any of you all know anything about grad school. It's very oftentimes kind of very easy for folks to connect with people in your cohort because you just spend so much time with them. And that's something that just wasn't happening for me. And it's a very isolating experience. It became apparent to me that something had to change. I just couldn't keep doing what I was doing. For some reason, it just felt safer to come out as non-binary at the time. So that's what I started out doing. My cohort was fine with it, but no one on campus, including the tutor center, really seemed to get it. It never made it a point to advocate for me. I remember a coworker being like, they, them, theirs, like, what? That's ridiculous. Language, that's not language. I'm not going to use that. And of course, they were a superior, so there's only so much you can do in that particular situation. So this story would keep spiraling after this. However, the more shows I went to, which I felt like at this point, I guess it was around my area for some reason, like so much during that time. I don't know, I like to say it's fate, maybe. I don't know, it was weird, but I feel like I was going to a show every 3 to 6 months. And the more I went to, the more confident I became. There was a point where I would just tell people I was Elliot at shows. The repeat affirmation was huge for me, and after doing so many times with mixed feelings that I was going to die if I didn't do this, I knew I had to do it. I don't remember ever being so terrified. I want to say this before this next point. We are very lucky on this campus to have some really rad counselors who are very educated on LGBTQ issues. But at this point, I started seeing a counselor on campus. Very, very green on trans topics, but she knew a couple of different things. I was going to come out to my folks and decided it was going to be a National Coming Out Day. I actually sent them a link to a letter that day, but took it down right away. And this was 2 a.m., so obviously they wouldn't have seen it. And I felt I was just devastated. I'm just like, why the hell can't I do this? But thankfully, not long after, I sent it at, why do I send things at 2 and 3 a.m.? I don't know. This one was at 3 a.m., the day after Halloween. I like to say it was on Halloween because that sounds more fun, but it wasn't technically on Halloween. And it was full out panic. But I thought, well, I have a counseling appointment the next day, which really didn't do anything because she didn't know what to do with me. But it came and went. I talked to the folks that night because I had silenced my phone throughout the entire day because I was terrified. It went well. I sent an email out to the grad program and work that night. And so one really cool thing, I say a lot of bad things about negative. My boss at the time actually was super supportive and probably was the only person where I worked that actually used the right pronouns, or at least tried to use the right pronouns constantly. I started going to like I said before, my coworkers tutor and the town in general were just not that supportive. But I did start going to a counselor in town who apparently was the quote unquote trans specialist, whatever the hell that means. And what's even worse about that is that she continuously used the wrong pronouns when she saw me. I was able to get on hormone replacement therapy through her though. And as I mentioned before, the night I was prescribed, I went to a show, and I was met with so much support at that show. And it was kind of like at that point that I told myself that no matter what happened after grad school, that I was done letting fear overtake me, and I was both going to fight to make wherever I ended up after grad school a better place, and just to be out to every person I knew, which was definitely not the plan before that. I kind of had the plan of going what's known as stealth right after I like got out of grad school, actually originally, and then, which if you don't know what stealth is, I'll just explain that. It essentially means that you don't tell people that you're trans, and that you just live your life as the gender that you identify as. Job hunting was hell, as with any job hunting, but I also had the added, not benefit, the opposite of benefit, and I can't think of that word right now, but the opposite of benefits that I had not had a legal name change yet. And so pretty much everywhere I applied, they knew that I was trans. I got denied so many different times, and it really ate with me. And I know for a fact that I got denied at least a few times because I was trans. I kind of feel like it was probably more than that, to be honest with you. Just kind of based on the way certain interviews went, and B, just the nature of some of the places I was applying. However, I finally got hired to start here with Trio down the hall, and it was just kind of a big sigh of relief. Before I say this first point, I want to say that the boss I had when I first moved to Platteville was a humongous advocate for me. I remember, like, here's just like a small thing. Let me give you a small example. I remember in the system, like they had my old name in there, and I'm just like, nah, I'll just deal with it. And she was very adamant of like changing it. Like, no, we're gonna change this. This isn't okay. And I don't know. It's just that was like one of the first interactions I had with her, and I thought, well, this is gonna be okay. But I won't lie to you. Platteville, it's been challenging. But the big sigh of relief here is it's not in terms of the constant misgendering that I was facing in Warrensburg. I won't really dig too much into that, just partly based because of time. I don't really think it's fitting for the conversation. But I will say, like, being seen as Elliot without the constant misgendering is beyond words. I soon after started a nonprofit aimed at helping LGBTQ folks. Seeing this kind of grow over the years has been amazing. This kind of paired with being more confident in general made me want to pursue the work for a living again. I mean, you might be like, what, again? Before this, I actually had to done things. I've done the LGBTQ plus student group thing. I worked with both college women's centers and LGBTQ centers. I even had like a grad certificate in women, gender, and sexuality studies. But I was just like, I'm not actually going to do anything with this experience. I'm just too scared. And I don't want that my entire identity to be wrapped up in this. But this organization made me want to pursue it again, like 100%. And that went faster than I thought it would get. Good. We have time for questions and stuff like that. Cool. That's what I get for cutting things. No, I flipped to the wrong. There we go. So I'd like to also acknowledge I'm extremely fortunate on so many aspects of my transitioning. Essentially having a supportive family and working a job where I can be openly trans. I'll also add just like being a European American, and not being perceived as having like any disabilities, for example, essentially gives me quite a bit of privilege in this particular population. I want to emphasize this too, because I think this is a problematic thing that I see in so many narratives, is that my problems definitely did not all disappear after transitioning. I'm still very much recovering from trauma and other mental health concerns. And I think, I don't know, like, I think there's just a lot of pressure from the world that everything has to be perfect if you transitioned, otherwise you're not really trans. I also add, and since I have time, I'll go into this a little bit, that it's been an extremely scary experience to come out as a survivor of sexual violence, because that's oftentimes used as a reason why people justify someone not being trans, is that, oh, you're just processing this trauma in a super negative way. And it's taken me it's been quite the trip, I'll say that, to publicly come out that this is what happened. And I'm still definitely processing all of that still, but I will say, with the help specifically of the women, gender, and sexuality classes, of all things, that probably really helped me kind of contextualize that, no, this wasn't me. This was just a problem with things like how masculinity is constructed and all this other stuff. So my biggest goal in life is to make as big of a difference as possible. I get asked sometimes, like, why would you stay in Platteville? It's such a small town and all this other stuff. And I feel like the biggest difference I can make is in a smaller town. You can go to a city and sure, you can make these great changes, but I feel like changes are heard more in small towns than they are in the larger cities. I don't know if that makes sense. I have no idea. I hope it does. But that, and like, I see what happened at my alma mater, and just kind of all the general just feelings of isolation, depression, and just not seeing the representation of other trans folks. And I'm just like, we very much need that here. So that's my answer. If anyone else curious, why Platteville? That's why Platteville. So just a few lessons. Transitioning while in rural US is beyond challenging. Something that I think isn't really talked about all that often is this idea, I think, I bring this up on another point, but I'll bring it up here. People don't talk about like geographical location as being a privilege. There is a significant difference in transitioning in Platteville, Wisconsin, than there is even like transitioning in Kansas City, Missouri. As is there a significant difference in transitioning in Kansas City, Missouri, as there is in San Francisco. Yet a lot of the attention on LGBTQ issues seems to be on coastal cities. And I think that's extremely problematic. Representation and accurate information are priceless. I think we're kind of in an age where there's a lot of misinformation out there still about LGBTQ folks, specifically beyond the first letters at this point. I'll still say there's a lot of misinformation on the first couple of letters. And I still think representation beyond folks that look like me is still very much missing. It's funny, I think some people just outgrow this whole like rebellion phase and all this other stuff. I don't think I'm ever gonna outgrow it. I think that's just a part of who I am at this point. And I think it's funny. I said before that you never want to listen to the same music as your dad. In a way, I pretty much listen to the same music as my dad, except it's I'll just say it's more updated. How about that? So and that pretty much, it's like, yeah, I'm never gonna actually outgrow this. So, and that's okay. And if I become like my dad, you know what, that's okay too. except I have more fashion sense than my dad. My dad's fashionable, don't get me wrong, but he doesn't have the fun looking shirts going for him. As I said before, the country often overlooks the Midwest, especially like the rural Midwest. And I don't know, I've had thoughts of like starting like maybe like this web long like newsletter or something like that, specifically on like issues that pertain to the Midwest, specifically like rural Midwest. Maybe someday we'll see if that ever actually comes to fruition, but it would be interesting. It's okay to take as much time as you need and face these scary things, just regardless of what it is. Just never feel pressured to run into a thing. Oh, this is what I forgot to put in here. Someone help me out here. The Dan Savage campaign of It Gets Better, I think it's very problematic too. Because, yes, things get better, but they don't become this magical unicorn that I think that sometimes campaigns like that paint it as. Supportive spaces are beyond important, and no one space can help everyone. Something that I also didn't bring to this presentation is that when I was part of these LGBTQ groups as a college student, I was not always welcome. Actually, there was one time when I was completely ostracized from a group and actually was kind of scared of going back to the group. So having like even like those shows, like people like those shows, like they're just shows for entertainment. Like no, they were so much more than that to me, as kind of that affirming space. I'm not going to use safe space. Affirming space and just place to explore was beyond helpful. And I'll say it again, there's just so much privilege I have as being a binary trans man. Like if I wanted to, like especially at this point in my transition, I could just move away from Platteville and just live a life being perceived as a cisgender male. And then, oh darn, I was 5 minutes short. Oh well. Are there any questions? I was hoping to leave 10 minutes there.
Hey, we're still good. We're still good with time. We did have a question come up in the chat though, if you're ready.
Sure.
The question was, can you explain the importance of using preferred pronouns and how you feel when someone misgenders you?
I personally would use just pronouns, not necessarily preferred pronouns to start this out, because preferred would imply that there's an option for you to use someone's pronouns. I would say the importance of pronouns are essentially like, wow, I'm having a brain fart. I explain this all the time. Why am I having some? It's essentially like, it's just an affirmation of like, this is who you are. Like if someone, yeah, I'm just gonna go, it's just affirmation. If someone uses the wrong pronouns over and over again for you, just implying that you're something that you're not, it's just kind of a devastating experience. I hope that answers that question.
Feel free to put questions in the chat or use the Q&A section if you got them. You can also raise your hand and we can unmute you as well if you would like to verbalize a question. Aaron wrote in the chat, thank you for sharing your story and being vulnerable.
Oh, thank you, Aaron. I didn't even know that you were in here, Aaron. So hi, by the way.
Tudor asks, Elliot, do you feel like the mental health field is doing all they need to do related to LGBTQIA?
I think it's gotten significantly better even since I transitioned. How about that? I will say from Warrensburg, Missouri, 100%, they definitely were not. Having a therapist, for example, constantly use the wrong pronouns on you and kind of sort of like implying that you're a woman over and over again when you're not was extremely harmful. I'm not saying that she wasn't supportive, but she definitely was not up to date on her LGBTQ education. And then I will say also, my therapist here in town has been super great. But I had a point this last summer where I was hospitalized a couple different times, and I would definitely say the folks working at these places oftentimes were not very up to date on trans education, is how I should put that, especially at the state-run institution, where they have you do this one thing, for example, called I think it's called like a dummy or something like that. Mannequin. That's the word I'm looking for. I feel better. Where essentially you strip in front of someone, and they didn't ask me once if who I was going to strip in front of, for example, and that was extremely traumatic. And oftentimes, like all these different things that they brought up, like they just didn't bring up the trans thing. That it's like that's not part of the issue that's like presented to me right now. I'm just like, no, like my lower surgery, for example, had just been like postponed. Like that's very prevalent to what's going on. And they were just pretending like that wasn't a thing. It was almost like they were afraid to bring it up. And so I think it has a ways to go. I think it's what I'm trying to say here. I think it can definitely improve from my perspective, which is still limited, especially in some of the hospital spaces. I hope that answers that question.
Kind of in that vein, Elliot, could you maybe briefly speak to what requirements trans folks have to go through in order to even get like access to different healthcares like hormone replacement therapy?
No, for sure. I was actually overall, as far as like the mental health provider's perspective, very fortunate. My first therapist was just like, yeah, I'll write you that. That was one good thing about her. But that for hormones, oftentimes there's an age limit. Let's put that out there. But oftentimes you have to have at least one letter. Now, more and more places are switching to a what's the word? Essentially like informed care or informed consent. That's what I'm looking for model. I think Caden, maybe you know more than this particular. I think like Planned Parenthood does that model. I am 99% sure that a lot of them do the informed consent model. When it comes to any sort of like gender affirmative surgery, very often there's an age limit of at least 18. Top surgery, which is mastectomy, essentially. It's a little more complicated. Let's just say mastectomy oftentimes is nipple grafts, but not always nipple grafts. How about that? We'll go with that. Essentially, you have to have most of the time just one letter, sometimes two. Then oftentimes you have to go to your primary care physician to get like physically checked up, and they have to approve that oftentimes too if you're going through insurance. And oftentimes, actually, this isn't covered by health insurance. My top surgery was not, at the time, our healthcare did not cover gender affirmative care. So that was completely out of pocket. Ironically enough, like I think a month after they announced that it was going to be included in healthcare, which was fun. And then for lower surgery, which I am going through insurance for, because there's no way in hell I'd be able to afford it outside of that. I think actually for that, they've been quoted at least 100K plus, and that's lowballing it. 2 letters of reference, and then approval from your primary care physician. And oftentimes especially for lower surgery, there's a weight requirement that I think people don't talk about either. That's actually why my first one got postponed, was because they ironically enough forgot to tell me that there was a weight limit, and that was beyond devastating. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. It's beyond devastating.
I appreciate that, Elliot. Thank you. We got 2 more questions that came in. Frank asked, what advice do you have for young folks in places that are making brutal laws against LGBTQ plus communities, like Florida and Texas?
I was not expecting that question, but I should have been expecting. I didn't even know Frank was in here. Hi, Frank. There's 2 different perspectives. Are we talking about youth specifically, or are we talking about people specifically? Let me first ask that.
I think the question is advice for folks living in these places where these laws are happening.
Okay.
Young folks in particular, like maybe how to cope with.
Yeah, I was gonna say, some people would give the advice that I think is problematic personally, but of just to move away when you get older. Just wait it out until you get older and you'll be able to move away. I don't necessarily support that advice for really 2 main reasons. A, most of the time it's not possible to just move away. B, nothing's ever going to change if you just move away. Like, that place is continuously going to get worse. But that's not your job necessarily to fix it either. I would also use that argument. The first argument is, I think the main argument is that it's not often possible to move away. Like, people are like, go to San Francisco. Like, who can afford San Francisco? Let's be honest. But I would say, like, advice for coping is, I always like to say there's oftentimes at least a pocket of people, no matter where you go, who are going to support you. Unless you're like in this town, there's like 3 people, you can probably find a pocket of supportive folks to kind of talk about. B would be, if you can, therapy. Everyone should be in therapy. That's my strong opinion. Everyone should be in therapy if they can. That's not necessarily always possible. C would be join all the Facebook groups. That's something I didn't bring up in my presentation, but Facebook groups were also really big in my transition too. I got so much information, like actually accurate information from just specific trans male Facebook groups. And then there's list after list of like mindfulness. There's different list after list of like different coping skills that you can use just to cope. But my main thing is specifically for youth. I just go straight back to some of the youth I've talked to in the support group I run, where they just can't like get away from their folks. And it's just ironically like we need to learn some coping skills. And at that point, we need to get you out of here as fast as we possibly can. And if anyone else has any tips, feel free to throw them out there. I think that answers that question.
Yeah, Elliot, I really like your point about finding community, whatever that looks like. And I think this is, especially when it comes to youth, this is where we really need allies from folks outside of the community, and not just like supporting youth, but calling state legislators and representatives and like showing up to these things too. I think in times of chaos, unfortunately, we do have politicians that use this opportunity to push laws through that have a really, really harmful residual effect. So definitely a time where we need external support.
Can I add to that specifically for Platteville?
Yeah, of course.
Southwest Rainbow Alliance, we actually do occasionally write to state senators. I think one of the reasons why people don't do that is they never know what to write. But what you can do is you can tag team on other people's letters, which makes your life so much easier. So if you're ever interested in doing that in Platteville, I can connect you with some folks.
That's awesome. Okay, we got one last question if you're up for it. Jen Collins asked, in your opinion, what could we be doing in School of Ed to better equip our future educators to better support LGBTQ plus students in K through 12 classrooms?
It's funny, not funny, but like in Southwest Rainbow Alliance, and this is something positive that I've seen from Platteville schools actually. So Platteville schools reached out to us actually, and were like, how we have these problems that are existing in our schools. How can we best address these? So one, if there is a local LGBTQ group, especially I'm referring more to like small towns, reach out to them and see if they can't like come in and kind of help educate you on LGBTQ issues if you're ignorant. And two, if you can, make sure like when you're making policies and whatnot to actually include LGBTQ folks. But I think that's not necessarily the question. I'm sorry. I think the question is, how can we better support LGBTQ folks? Simple things like setting the tone by like, what are your pronouns the first day? Or saying like, you know, if you want to experiment with a new name or something like that, feel free to come up and just tell me. And just setting ground rules from day one that this is and this is not what is okay. And I would add to that having class buy-in to those rules. And just going to every single thing that you can that is specific to LGBTQ education. Like if you're on campus, for example, we have what's now known as Brave Space, what was formerly known as Allied Training. That would be a good thing to attend. But yeah, I think really a big thing with these is just setting the tone and educating. I don't like the word correcting, educating folks as you see it happening, and like challenging them when they say something like, I'm gonna give an example. That's so gay apparently is something that's really prominent in my little sister's middle school. One of my favorite responses, and this you can only do this if A, you're comfortable, and B, you're actually part of the LGBTQ population, is, oh, do you mean me? What do you mean by that? That's one of my favorite responses to that. If you're not, you can kind of just ask the person like, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by when you say that's so gay? And maybe just seeing like, if you value, are your values consistent with like being loving and supporting? Because by saying that, you're not being like loving and supporting folks. And if anyone else has any other tips, I'm always open to any other tips too.
Awesome. Well, we definitely want to be mindful of your time, Elliot. So if anybody has any last questions, please feel free to put them in. Otherwise, we'll wrap up here in a minute. But thanks so much, everybody, for being here.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.